Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Kentucky. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. The year was 1859, the same season when strange lights flared across the American sky, an aurora so fierce that telegraph wires burned and operators swore the heavens themselves were charged. Newspapers later called it the Carrington Storm, a celestial disturbance unlike anything recorded before. While cities looked upward in wonder, the people of Lock Hollow, a quiet bend of farmland tucked between Rowan and Carter counties, found their attention drawn inward, toward a house whose stillness defied the storm. The Lock family had lived there for nearly a generation. Silas Lock, a sawyer by trade, was a man of even temper, known for mending fences as easily as he mended quarrels. His wife, Ellen, kept a small chapel diary where she wrote prayers for rain, for harvest, and for their long-awaited children. When the twins finally arrived, two pale girls born just after midnight on August 31st, the doctor remarked that their cries came seconds apart but ended in perfect unison. He noted it in his ledger as a curious harmony, though no one paid much mind. The Hollow folk were used to oddities: milk that soured too quickly, wells that whispered in frost, children who dreamed of places they'd never seen. But there was something uneasy about the twins. Their eyes opened together, turned together, even followed the same movements in silence as though guided by a single thread. Visitors found it charming at first, a miracle perhaps after so many barren years. Yet as the months passed, Ellen began to notice things that felt less like blessing and more like mimicry. When one child bruised her knee, a mark bloomed on the other the next morning. When fever took the younger, the elder's pulse quickened in sleep. By their second year, they had developed an uncanny habit of waking moments before any thunder, sitting upright in the dark crib, whispering to one another in a language their mother swore she never taught. Ellen tried to tell her husband, but Silas dismissed it as imagination, a mother's worry in a nervous age. Still, she began keeping a second diary, hidden under the floorboard, recording each strange correspondence. The first tragedy came in winter. Snow closed the roads. The doctor could not reach them. One of the twins, Martha, took ill. Ellen remembered hearing her daughter's shallow breath fade, just as the other, May, stirred awake and whispered, "She's cold now." When they buried Martha in the small family plot behind the mill, May refused to eat for 3 days. Then suddenly she laughed, a sound her mother later described as borrowed. 2 weeks later, May began speaking in phrases no one understood. She'd sit beside the fire, tracing her fingers along the grain of the wooden floor, murmuring about a toy that had been buried with me. Silas burned Ellen's diary soon after, declaring that grief breeds madness. But in Lock Hollow, neighbors started keeping their distance. They said the surviving twins' voice sometimes echoed twice, as if the dead sister answered back. The Lock house stood a mile beyond the timberline, near a half-collapsed barn that locals swore no wind could flatten, yet no man could rebuild. After Martha's burial, the Hollow grew quieter. No one sent word or wandered past their gate after dusk. Ellen took to hanging lavender over the doorway, a charm she claimed kept fever from returning. But most evenings she simply watched her surviving child sit at the window, whispering to the dark. By the following spring, May had begun drawing faces in soot upon the hearthstone, always two, always identical. When Silas asked her who they were, she said, "It's us before the doctor came." The remark unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He scolded her, scrubbed the marks away, and told Ellen to keep the child occupied. Yet that night, long after he'd gone to bed, the drawings reappeared, this time etched faintly into the ashpan itself, as though carved from the inside. The county clerk, Mr. Edwin Carver, recorded in his daily ledger that Ellen Lock visited him twice that May, seeking a copy of the birth record for both daughters, one living, one departed. Carver's note, still legible today, carries a brief marginal remark. "Mother fearful child possesses likeness beyond measure." It remains one of the earliest surviving official references to the case. By midsummer, the child's sleep grew violent. Ellen described hearing two voices during May's nightmares, one pleading, one humming an old cradle tune. Silas insisted it was a trick of the wind, and moved his bed to the far room. On August 31st, the twins' shared birthday, Ellen awoke to find May gone. Her footprints led through the frost-tipped grass to the family plot behind the mill. There, the small mound over Martha's grave was disturbed, as if a hand had clawed upward from beneath. Ellen fainted on the spot. When Silas and the neighbors dug to calm her fears, they found the coffin lid cracked by soil pressure and the lining torn, but the remains untouched. The coroner, Dr. Samuel Keats, wrote that it appeared to be subsidence of soft ground, nothing more. But Keats later told a reporter from the Louisville Journal that the surviving twin stood nearby, her palms pressed to the earth, murmuring, "It's warmer now." That brief article never reached wider circulation. It was the same autumn when the nation's newspapers filled with reports of the Great Aurora and the strange disruptions to telegraph lines, the aftermath of the Carrington event that had dazzled America only months before. Perhaps that celestial commotion buried the smaller, quieter story of the Locke family. Yet in Rowan County, the incident became a private legend that a child had drawn her dead sister back through the soil by the force of shared breath. Over the next decade, scattered references would appear in church logs and asylum intakes, always describing twin symptoms or echo afflictions. And behind each, archivists now suspect, lay someone who once knew the Lockes of 1859. By 1863, the Locke farm had fallen into partial disrepair. Silas kept to the mill, working alone until dusk, while Ellen withdrew almost entirely from the village. Parish records from Reverend Thomas Dilly note her as present at worship but silent, eyes fixed toward the north aisle, as though awaiting someone unseen. Dilly's handwriting later grows erratic, as if he too felt something uncanny about her presence. May Locke, now 6 years old, rarely spoke to anyone outside her mother. She wandered the fields with a child's calm, humming what sounded like two-part hymns in a single voice. One line, written by Ellen in her remaining notebook, read, "She sings as if echoing herself." The mother's notes were later found water-stained, tucked behind a loose plank in the kitchen wall when the property was sold. Each entry described a day when May seemed to change, adopting gestures, even handwriting, that belonged unmistakably to her dead twin. In the spring of 1864, a schoolteacher named Miss Lydia Crane was hired to instruct local children at the Dilly Chapel. Her attendance rolls list M. Locke among 10 pupils. In a letter now preserved in county archives, Crane wrote, "She sits always between 2 chairs, never upon one. When corrected, she apologizes twice." The teacher assumed it to be shyness until she discovered identical writing exercises completed simultaneously, one in each hand, lying side by side on May's desk. She kept them for evidence. The ink strokes later examined by a constable during an unrelated inquiry were so similar that he believed the papers had been traced. During those same months, the war pressed close. Troops passed through Rowan County, and rumors told of deserters hiding in barns. One night, a skirmish at the timberline sent sparks across the Locke property. Neighbors claimed the surviving twin was seen standing in the firelight, calm while bullets hissed through the trees. When asked later what she saw, she said, "My sister wanted to watch them fall like stars." Dr. Keats, who'd once attended the birth, returned briefly that autumn while surveying fever outbreaks. In his field diary, he wrote only, "Mother deteriorated. Child appears doubled in effect. May call this the reflexive malady." The note was later cited by Professor Elbridge Vaughan in his 1887 paper on sympathetic disorders, one of the few medical attempts to classify what folklore had already named the Locke rebirth. After the war ended, Silas sold the mill and vanished westward under another name. No document records his death. Ellen and the girl remained behind, surviving on charity from the chapel. Visitors recalled hearing the piano play 2 melodies overlapping, though Ellen swore she'd pressed only one set of keys. By the late 1860s, the Locke house had become a curiosity. Travelers spoke of twin shadows seen in its windows at twilight, one taller, one faint, moving in synchrony. The legend might have faded if not for what was found there in 1871. A child's journal bound in red cloth, written in 2 distinct hands, arguing over which name belonged to the living. The discovery of that red cloth journal in 1871 changed how the locals remembered the Locke story. The entry on the first page read only, "I am Martha and I am not." Beneath it, a second hand had added, "We share the same dream, only I wake first." The journal passed through several hands before reaching Constable Henry Mott, who sent it to the county seat in Moorhead. His transmittal note still exists in the courthouse archive, bearing a faint smudge of wax. "Recovered from abandoned dwelling at Loch Hollow. Recommend medical inspection before disposal." When Dr. Keats examined the pages, he noticed each pair of entries was dated the same day, but written in slightly different styles. One looping and deliberate, the other cramped and childlike. The ink tested from the well at the Loch property matched both. Keats's personal remark in the margin, later copied by his assistant, was brief: "Possible fugue," though language suggests coexistence. That was his final known writing before his sudden resignation and relocation to Illinois the next year. Reverend Dilly conducted a quiet service to cleanse the abandoned house, yet he noted afterward that the air inside felt split, as though two rooms occupied the same space. Villagers began avoiding the path entirely. Grass grew through the planks of the porch, and rain seeped through the roof until the wallpaper peeled like old skin. Still, someone kept tending the grave behind the mill. Every September, fresh flowers appeared, wild asters and chicory, always bound with red thread. By 1875, the property had been claimed by the Harlan County Orphan Board, which used it briefly to house displaced children from the war's aftermath. One matron, Miss Ada Brimley, wrote in her quarterly report that the youngest of the orphans spoke of the whispering sisters in the east bedroom. She requested relocation within the month, and the orphan program was discontinued shortly after. County ledgers list the reason simply as unsuitable environment. It was during this same period that Professor Elbridge Vaughan of Lexington University began collecting testimonies for his forthcoming work on reflexive identity disorders. He cited the Loch case as an early rural instance of sympathetic manifestation following twin loss. When presenting at a medical congress in 1876, he mentioned the region's lingering fascination with rebirth legends, connecting them, perhaps for the first time, to the larger folklore movement rising after the Carrington event of 1859. Whether through Vaughan's lectures or Brimley's abandoned records, the legend reached beyond Kentucky. Newspapers in St. Louis and Nashville printed condensed accounts under headlines like "The Girl Who Dreamed Her Sister Back." Yet each retelling introduced errors. Some claimed both twins lived, others that neither did. What remained consistent was the unease, the idea that one soul had refused to divide. By the turn of the 1880s, the Loch property was listed for auction. No buyer came forward. Travelers along the eastern road said they could still hear a child humming near the shuttered mill, a tune that rose and fell in two voices. Even skeptics noted the sound carried farther than wind should. When the Loch property finally sold in 1881, it went to a widower named Jonas Reddick, a man with little patience for folklore. He arrived from Ohio with a wagon of tools and 2 hired men, intent on restoring the mill and clearing the overgrown graves. In his first letter home, he described the land as fine and level, though the silence feels weighted. His crew worked 3 days before quitting, claiming the saws dulled faster than iron should, and that whispers rose from the floorboards at night. Reddick dismissed them, paid their wages, and stayed on alone. County deeds confirm his ownership, but list no subsequent harvest yields. Neighbors rarely saw smoke from his chimney. Then, in March of 1882, the local magistrate received a parcel addressed in Reddick's hand. Inside was a single item, a small red thread-bound bouquet of asters, identical to those once placed on the Loch graves, accompanied by a note reading, "The child hums again." "She wants her other song." Reddick vanished soon after. The sheriff's search found the house empty. Though his horse remained tethered and unfed, within weeks, talk spread that the hollow itself had gone wrong. Birds avoided its trees and livestock balked at the gate. Reverend Dilly, now aged and half-blind, visited one last time and later confided to a parishioner, "I heard 2 sets of steps behind me, though I was alone." His testimony, recorded by the church secretary, marks the final first-hand account before the site was officially condemned. In the years that followed, the Loch twins' story entered medical journals and pulp pamphlets alike. Some physicians reclassified it as twin telepathic trauma, others as pure hysteria. Professor Vaughan published his final essay in 1887, citing Dr. Keats's earlier observations of 1859 and linking them to neurological resonance between mirrored individuals. He concluded with a line that later scholars found chillingly poetic. Perhaps the living must sometimes serve as vessel for the departed, until the balance of the soul is restored. By 1890, all physical trace of the locks had faded, except the gravestone behind the mill, which weathered into near illegibility. Only the twin outline of two faint initials, ML, remained. Locals said that on certain nights, the stone glimmered as if frostless, drawing light where none existed. The county attempted to level the property in 1893, but surveyors reported compass needles spinning without rest. Their instruments failed entirely near the old foundation. In their formal report to the Land Office, they described a persistent magnetic interference consistent with iron deposits, though none were ever found. That same year, the Louisville Courier published a retrospective column on the 1859 Carrington storm, recalling how electric currents once danced upon telegraph lines. A brief sidebar mentioned the lock case, labeling it a domestic curiosity from Kentucky's folklore past. For readers outside Rowan County, the connection between those celestial fires and one family's strange affliction may have seemed distant. But for those who lived near the hollow, both disturbances had always belonged to the same year and the same trembling earth. By century's end, the lock house had fallen completely, its beams scattered across the clearing. Yet the field around it remained oddly untouched by weeds, as if something beneath still breathed, quietly shaping the soil from below. At the opening of the new century, 1901, the county authorized a brief geological survey of the old lock property. The task fell to Mr. Walter Baines, an amateur historian with a fascination for magnetic anomalies and the folklore of eastern Kentucky. Baines's surviving field book describes the hollow as oppressively still, the air charged, as though the telegraph storms of '59 had never fully dispersed. His notes mention finding fragments of two porcelain dolls beneath the collapsed hearth, each with identical cracks across the left eye. He sent them to Lexington University for study. They were later misplaced in transit, and the receipt of delivery bears only the single word returned. Baines's report reawakened public curiosity. A correspondent from the Lexington Herald, Clara Mott, traveled to document what remained. Her article, "The House That Refused to Die," printed in March of 1902, spoke not of hauntings but of echoes, footsteps that repeated after her own, faint as breath. She quoted an unnamed farmer who claimed to see two girls walking through the fog, one always a step behind the other. The piece stirred enough attention that the county briefly considered fencing the grounds as a historical site, but funding never materialized. That spring, Reverend Dilly's successor held a small outdoor service at the edge of the property. The purpose, he wrote, was to release the ground from superstition, yet his own sermon notes betray unease. Wind rose without direction. Parishioners swore they heard a child answering. The hymns from the woods. Among the attendees was an aging nurse named Ada Brimley, once matron of the orphan board, that had occupied the lock house in the 1870s. After the service, she told Baines quietly, they never left. They only changed who listens. A month later, Baines fell ill with what doctors called paralytic fever. In his final coherent entry, he described hearing 2 knocks on his study door each night precisely at 11:03, the time local records listed for Martha Locke's death 42 years earlier. He died 3 days afterward. Among his effects was a sketch of the hollow, 2 ovals intersecting like mirrored eyes, drawn in trembling pencil. When county officials inventoried his papers, they found references again to the Carrington event, the 1859 solar storm that had once electrified the skies. Baines had underlined a passage describing how currents of unseen energy passed freely through the earth itself. Beside it he had written, "Perhaps souls too are currents." After Baines's death, no one attempted further study of the site. Travelers along the Rowan Carter Road claimed their lamps dimmed near the bend where the old mill once stood. A few reported hearing a child's hum drifting from the fog, always in harmony, never alone. By 1909, maps had dropped the name Loch Hollow altogether. The clearing was marked simply as disused property unsurveyed. Those who still live nearby avoid speaking of it. They say the air there never stills, that the ground seems to breathe just once before dawn, and that sometimes when the wind turns cold, two voices call each other by the same name. By the autumn of 1909, the name Loch Hollow had nearly vanished from every map, yet in private correspondence it persisted like a bruise that would not fade. Among the papers left by Professor Elbridge Vaughan, whose studies had once catalogued the loch phenomenon, archivists found an unfinished manuscript titled Echoes of Rebirth. The first page carried a date, September 17, 1909, and a single notation in the margin, Return to origin before frost. Vaughan's colleagues believed he meant to revisit the site one last time. He never returned to Lexington. A postmaster in Carter County recalled forwarding a parcel under Vaughan's name that same week. It contained a small wooden box bound with red thread and no return address. When opened years later, the contents proved to be a child's locket with two identical photographs, one image printed over the other, the outlines faintly misaligned, as though developed twice on the same plate. On the reverse, written in faded ink, were the words Martha May merged. Vaughan's disappearance coincided with a period of heavy storms across eastern Kentucky, remnants of a tropical cyclone that washed out local bridges. Newspaper archives from October 1909 mention a professor lost in rising waters near the Old Mill Road. The story occupied 3 paragraphs, then vanished from print. Some locals said they'd seen lantern light deep in the hollow that night, swinging like a pendulum between the trees. When the rain stopped, no debris or remains were found, only 2 sets of footprints in the mud, both barefoot, both small. After Vaughan's presumed death, the university sealed his papers. Decades later, when historians reviewed them, they found meticulous diagrams linking electromagnetic disturbances from the 1859 Carrington event to patterns of sympathetic resonance between individuals. In the margin beside one drawing he had scribbled, "The lochs prove that the living can conduct memory like current through soil." The page ended abruptly, smudged as if by water. Meanwhile, the hollow reverted to wilderness. The mill foundation collapsed entirely, leaving only the iron wheel half buried in silt. Hunters who strayed too near claimed their compass needles spun, and their dogs refused to cross the creek. One, Isaac Mott, told the Rowan Ledger in 1910 that he heard 2 girls laughing in the thicket, though no prints followed his own. The editor declined to publish the story, but filed it under Curiosities, Hollow Region. When the county surveyed the area later that year, the measuring chain came up 1 yard short on every pass, as if the ground itself resisted closure. The foreman's report concluded, magnetic anomaly consistent with local ore deposits, yet ore was never found. Even the boundary markers seemed to drift after each season, leaning toward the center, as if drawn by unseen weight. No further mention of the Loch family appears in official records after 1909. Only a final note survives in an unsigned ledger at the courthouse. Property uninhabitable. Sounds persist at night. That line, scrawled in different ink, remains the last written trace of the case, ending precisely where history itself refuses to settle. By winter's end of 1909, the hollow lay silent beneath a skin of frost. A few farmers from the neighboring ridge cut through it on their way to the river, swearing afterward that the air there crackled like static before a lightning strike. They spoke of a faint humming, more felt than heard, as if the frozen soil carried a low vibration. None lingered long enough to investigate. That February, a minor landslip exposed the remnants of the Loch family cellar. County workmen, clearing debris from the adjoining road, uncovered fragments of ledger paper fused to the brick. Among them was a page that bore half of a hymn, "If one should sleep and one should wake." The rest was gone, eaten by damp. The fragments were sent to the courthouse archive, but later misfiled among tax receipts. When they resurfaced decades afterward, a clerk noted a thin residue of iron oxide along the edges, as though the ink itself had rusted. A few miles away, in the small parish school that replaced Reverend Dilly's chapel, the children sang an old rhyme that no teacher admitted to teaching them. 2 to see and 2 to know, 1 above and 1 below. The origin of that verse remains unknown, but linguists later traced similar couplets to 19th century lullabies from rural Kentucky, possibly inspired by the Lock tragedy. The words lingered in oral tradition long after the names had faded. During the same spring, a letter reached the Lexington Herald from an unsigned correspondent claiming to be a surviving relation of the Locks. It read in part, "The hollow still breathes. There is a place where the frost never holds, and each thaw brings the scent of lavender and ash." The editor dismissed it as rural fancy, though he filed the original under meteorological oddities because of the magnetic reports still circulating from the area. In May of that year, a final county inspection took place before the land was struck from the official rolls. The inspector, J.H. Pennington, described a shallow depression where the house had stood, soil unusually warm to the touch despite low temperature. He concluded his report with a sentence that later generations of researchers found haunting in its restraint. "There is movement beneath that cannot be accounted for by wind or water." Pennington's notebook also contained a small pressed flower, an aster bound with red thread, its petals perfectly preserved. He dated it simply May 31st, 1909. That specimen, stored in the county archive, remains intact even now. Botanists remark that the color has never fully faded. No official account follows. The road through the hollow was rerouted that summer, leaving the site to overgrowth. By autumn, only a few timbers of the mill wheel showed above the reeds. Yet travelers passing at dusk sometimes reported a child's song riding the breeze, two voices, faint, overlapping in a single tune that ended exactly where another began. By midsummer 1909, Rowan County prepared its new census roll. The Lock tract, now classified as no resident, unfarmed, drew a brief remark from the enumerator George Talbot. "Ground unusually unsettled," he meant the soil heavy from thaw and rain, but the phrasing would later gain darker overtones when the clerk, copying his notes, found tiny streaks of soot pressed between the pages, as though the paper itself had been held near flame. Talbot's journal, discovered years later in an attic trunk, offers the last contemporary portrait of the hollow. He wrote, "Even at noon the place feels dim, light drawn inward. Compass wanders. At Creek's Bend a child's shoe rests upright in mud. Size 3. No record lists the recovery of such an item, yet a photograph glued to the next page shows twin depressions beside it. Two sets of prints, one half the size of the other. When enlarged, the tracks appear perfectly parallel, heel to toe, as though one walker had mirrored another's step in exact rhythm." Talbot camped there one night, hoping to chart the magnetic drift. His later entry, dated August 2nd, reads in hurried script, "Temperature dropped 12 degrees at midnight. Heard harmonic tone low but distinct. Sounded like hum through telegraph wire, though no poles within 10 miles. He ended with the single line, "If this is earth current, it breathes." After that, the journal stops. When he failed to deliver the census sheets, deputies found his tent flattened yet undisturbed, bedroll unrolled, lamp still half full. Only the compass remained, needle frozen, pointing east toward the mill ruins. The sheriff's official report avoided speculation. He marked Talbot missing, presumed drowned, but those who examined the site noticed something peculiar. The creek showed no sign of flood or struggle, and every fern along its edge leaned the same direction, as if bent by a single exhalation. That autumn, before frost returned, the county foreman ordered the area fenced to deter trespassers. He hired 3 men from Moorhead, each of whom quit before the work was finished. One, Silas Wren, told the Courier weeks later that their fence posts sank too deep, like the ground wanted them gone. The paper printed his statement without comment under the heading Local Oddities. In the last surviving administrative note from December 1909, written by Clerk Mary Edson, the hollow is summarized in one careful sentence: "No further entry to be made. Property considered extinguished." Below her signature, someone, perhaps a later archivist, penciled a faint addition: "Listen closely. It still counts twice." With that line, the records close. Yet even as officials sealed the ledgers, families living on the ridge claimed to hear twin knocks echo across the valley at night, always 2 beats apart, always stopping when answered. Those sounds marked the final year the Lock name appeared in any ledger, after which history, like the soil itself, simply swallowed the rest. In the closing days of 1909, a frost heavier than any in memory swept across Rowan County. Ice glazed the mill creek and held for nearly a month, turning the hollow into a mirror of grey glass. Travellers along the ridge said the reflection below showed more trees than grew above, as if a second forest waited under the ice. The phenomenon drew brief attention from the Louisville Courier, whose winter column remarked that peculiar optical illusions trouble the valley near the disused lock property. Afterward, the name slipped from public notice once more. That same winter, Ephraim Dorset, a retired telegraph operator from Lexington, arrived to visit his daughter, who kept a boarding house in Moorhead. Dorset had lived through the Carrington event 50 years earlier and still told stories of the night the skies caught fire. When he heard talk of the hollow's strange compass readings, curiosity carried him out to see for himself. His diary, later found among his daughter's belongings, records a journey of barely 4 miles that seemed to take an entire day. He wrote, "At the edge of the property, I felt a static pull like before a storm. The air smelled of iron. My pocket compass trembled between east and west. Then came a tone, same as a telegraph current when the key sticks." Dorset left soon after sunset, shaken, and spent the next week sketching a crude map with twin spirals converging in the center. Beneath it he wrote, "The current doubles here." 2 weeks later he suffered a sudden seizure while repairing an old transmitter. His final words, recorded by his daughter, were, "Tell them it's still singing." When she later retrieved his coat, she found fine dust in the lining, pale as ground limestone, faintly metallic to the touch. Laboratory notes from 1910 list its composition as unidentifiable ferric compound, unstable when exposed to light. The Board of Records filed Dorset's effects alongside Talbot's missing person report, noting the peculiar resonance between cases. For a short while, there was talk of assembling all surviving lock materials for a formal inquiry. But the courthouse fire of April 1910 ended that plan before it began. Flames spread through the West Wing, consuming nearly every ledger connected to the hollow. Witnesses said the fire moved oddly, low and circular, as though tracing the outline of something already marked upon the floor. When dawn came, only one shelf stood unburned. On it lay Pennington's field note, preserved by chance or intention. The final line read, "There is movement beneath that cannot be accounted for by wind or water." Beside it, someone, perhaps Edson before her death, had penciled a second phrase, "And still they breathe." By midsummer, the county's attention turned elsewhere. Roads were repaired, farms resumed, and the hollow was left to thickets and silence. Yet anyone passing that bend after dark could swear they heard the faint rhythm of tapping wire beneath the ground, steady as an old signal repeating itself to no one who could answer. By late December 1909, the hollow was once again covered in snow. The last recorded visitor that year was Sheriff Amos Callan, who rode out on routine inspection after reports of trespassers. His written account, preserved only because it was filed separately from the burned courthouse records, describes the area as abandoned yet not empty. He noted faint impressions in the snow, 2 sets of tracks circling the ruins in opposite directions, meeting at the collapsed foundation, then diverging again. "No boot pattern," he wrote. Barefoot and the ground frozen solid, Callan's horse refused to approach the mill site. He tethered it near the creek and continued on foot, hearing what he thought was the low hum of ice shifting against rock. Yet when he paused, the sound ceased. In his journal he added a curious detail, "Air warmer near center of hollow. My breath did not frost." He returned to town before nightfall and entered only a brief notation in his official log, "Nothing unlawful discovered. Atmosphere unpleasant." The phrase puzzled later historians. It remains the final government entry concerning the property. Within weeks, word of the courthouse fire spread across Kentucky, and with it came the legend that certain documents had burned too slowly, that parchment with the lock's names glowed rather than charred. Miners working 20 miles east claimed the smoke from that night drifted low and split in two, forming parallel trails across the valley. Folklore merged with report until no one could tell which came first. On the first Sunday of 1910, Reverend Dilly's replacement delivered a sermon about the sin of doubling, warning against obsession with the dead. Parishioners later said his candle sputtered twice before extinguishing itself mid-verse. When the wick was relit, the flame bent toward the east window, the direction of the hollow. Such stories filled the months that followed, passed quietly between farmhouses like winter sickness. In a final fragment from the era, discovered among Vaughan's correspondence, a colleague recalls receiving a small package without return mark. Inside lay 2 identical pages torn from the Lexington Herald, one the obituary of Dr. Samuel Keats, d. 1880, the other blank except for the handwritten line, "He was never meant to leave." The sender remains unknown, the handwriting faintly resembling Vaughan's own. By spring thaw, travelers found that the creek near the Lock property no longer froze. Warm mist rose from it even on cold mornings, carrying a scent of iron and lavender. Old farmers called it the breathing water. They avoided it, but children from the ridge dared each other to run down and listen. Those who claimed to hear anything said the same words every time: "She's awake." When the county finally erased the Lock tract from its survey in mid-1910, the notation read simply, "Boundary absorbed by erosion." Yet locals insisted the ground there never truly sank. It only folded inward, like a lung drawing its last breath before another begins. The last winter before the hollow's erasure left the land glazed in a strange stillness. Letters from that season describe nights so quiet the snow itself seemed to listen. In one of those letters, dated January 3, 1910, Mary Edson, the same clerk who had once written "Property Extinguished," confided to a friend that she dreamed nightly of 2 figures on a frozen hill. Standing back to back, she wrote, "Each time I call to them, they turn as one." That letter, never posted, was found in her desk after her sudden death of heart failure a week later. Within days, her successor, Clerk William Tare, reopened the sealed Lock file to finalize remaining land taxes. The following morning, witnesses found his office door ajar and his papers strewn across the floor. Only the Lock folder remained untouched, placed neatly in the center of the desk. On the outer sleeve, in a hand no one recognized, were 4 words written in fading graphite: "We keep our count." The handwriting bore a faint resemblance to Edson's, though she had been buried 2 days earlier. Meanwhile, up the ridge, ice storms split the old birches and flattened the fence built after the Talbot disappearance. Those who passed said they saw faint light beneath the snow, like lanterns buried face down. A hunter from Carter County found a child's ribbon snagged in a branch, still bright red despite the frost. He sold it to a traveling curiosity dealer, who displayed it for years labeled simply, "Relic of the Lock Twins." In February, the medical student from Lexington University, Harold Crane, visited the site after reading Professor Vaughan's unfinished notes. His diary, later recovered among university archives, details a single night's stay in the hollow. He recorded the temperature as unreasonably mild, his lantern dimming though the oil was full. "Heard rhythmic pulse in ground," he wrote, "not wind, regular as a heartbeat." At dawn he departed in haste, leaving behind his measuring rods and compass. When a retrieval team returned 3 days later, the rods were gone. Only the compass remained, its glass intact but the needle spinning in slow circles. Crane's final entry back at Lexington read, "The phenomenon repeats exactly at 50 years. If the first disturbance was 1859, the next awakening belongs to now." He died within the year, struck by lightning on an otherwise clear afternoon while crossing the University Quad. Witnesses said the flash split into 2 distinct bolts before striking. After that, no formal studies of the Lock Hollow were attempted. The land was quietly absorbed into state forest, its coordinates miscopied on official maps. Travelers occasionally glimpsed a shimmer over the frozen creek at dusk, a mirage perhaps, or the residue of that old electric storm that once set telegraph wires singing. Yet among the elders of Rowan County, one phrase endured: "When the air hums twice, keep walking." When spring came, the meltwater from the ridge carried silt down through the hollow, softening what was left of the mill foundation. A passing survey crew from the railway company recorded the valley as unstable terrain, unsuitable for bridge approach. One engineer, John Merrin, noted in his field book a faint vibration underfoot, as if low thunder persisted underground. His remark, minor at the time, later became a cornerstone in the quiet file of engineers and naturalists who tried to reconcile physical evidence with legend. Merrin returned the following week to collect mineral samples. He chipped away part of the foundation wall and found, embedded in the mortar, a child's tooth no larger than a kernel of corn. Thinking it belonged to some old burial, he wrapped it in cloth and placed it in his pocket. That night, according to his diary, the tooth clicked against the glass of my lantern as though struck from within. He threw it into the creek at first light and left the site for good. Meanwhile, in Moorhead, Reverend Dilly's successor compiled a short pamphlet for the parish school, titled Warnings Against Reflection. Its central parable told of two mirrors that faced one another. Until they swallowed their own light, parents complained that the lesson frightened children, and most copies were withdrawn. Only one remains, the margins filled with penciled notes from a student, believed to be Nora Brimley, daughter of the former orphan matron. In childish scrawl she had written, "They are only quiet when watched." By midsummer, the county road crews attempted to reroute a drainage ditch through the hollow. The first day's excavation unearthed a length of iron wire buried deep in the clay, twisted into loops. The foreman, suspecting it to be remnants of telegraph line from the 1859 storm era, cut a section and took it home. His wife later told neighbors that at night the coil emitted a sound like two voices humming from inside a shell. Within a week the wire was gone, melted, she said after a thunderclap with no rain. Later inspection found the trench already filled by fresh soil, smooth as if tamped from below. The work was abandoned. Official justification, ground slippage and cost. That autumn, a traveling scholar named Dr. Helen Rusk, researching the effects of magnetic flux on rural folklore, stopped at the courthouse to ask for surviving lock papers. She was told politely but firmly that no such family had ever existed. Yet in the registrar's handwriting guide, she consulted moments later. One practice signature read Ellen Locke, ink older than the book itself. Rusk made a note. Some names rewrite themselves. She spent one evening in a boarding room overlooking the valley and claimed to see lantern light flicker twice in quick succession, always returning to the same point. In her later lecture at the State University, she concluded, "The Lock Hollow case is less a haunting than a rhythm left unbroken. Autumn of 1909 lingered longer than usual, the air dry enough that even moss crisped on stone. Dr. Helen Rusk remained in Moorhead longer than planned, compelled by what she called the residue of repetition. In her letters to a colleague in Lexington, she described waking each night at precisely 2:14 a.m. to the sound of a soft double tap on the window pane. Once could be wind, she wrote, but the second insists." She kept a careful log of temperature, wind direction, and barometric pressure, each entry concluding with the same note, "Pattern holds." Rusk visited the hollow on October 9th, guided by a farmhand who refused to cross the creek. She walked alone to the center of the clearing where the mill had stood. There she recorded a feeling of subtle vibration, like a pulse within the ground. Using a portable galvanometer, she measured faint current oscillations that rose and fell in a regular interval of 2 beats every 6 seconds. Her sketch shows twin loops crossing at the midpoint, an echo of Vaughan's old diagrams. She wrote in her field journal, "The Earth itself keeps count, perhaps echoing the solar storm of 1859. That evening she returned to town, pale and unsteady. The boarding-house keeper recalled her hands trembling so badly she spilled her tea. At dawn she requested paper from the telegraph office and composed a long message addressed to the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, Washington. The operator, Ephraim Reese, later testified that the signal stuttered strangely while she transmitted it, every word sending a faint crackle through the receiver. He remembered the final line distinctly. 2 frequencies remain active. No reply ever came. Within a week, Rusk was found unconscious on the steps of the courthouse. She recovered partially but spoke little, muttering that the second voice learned the first. When she left Kentucky that December, she left behind her instruments and notes. Only a single folded page accompanied her, a rubbing of 2 parallel grooves in the soil, captioned Heartbeat of the Hill. Her abandoned equipment was inventoried by Clark Terre. His list includes 1 galvanometer, 1 cracked compass, 1 notebook, pages numbered twice. In the margin he wrote, "Unsure which set correct." That note, preserved among the remaining archives, marks the last formal documentation connected to the Locke property. By the final week of the year, Snow returned and sealed the hollow. Hunters crossing the ridge claimed to see faint steam rising from the creek despite freezing temperatures. The scent of iron lingered, and dogs whined when led near the old fence line. Those who dared approach said the snow there never settled evenly. It drifted in twin spirals, circling a center no one could stand upon. Locals took it as the last sign that the ground still remembered, breathing once more before the maps would finally erase its name. When the new year turned, the hollow slept under drifts that muffled every sound except the slow creak of the frozen creek. The last surviving record from that winter belongs to Martha Pennington, niece of the late surveyor whose notes had spoken of movement beneath the soil. Her diary, discovered decades later among family papers, describes the hollow in a language closer to prayer than observation. "There is rhythm here," she wrote on January 2, 1910. "It calls the same name twice and waits for an answer." Pennington had gone there, seeking photographs of frost patterns for a geology exhibit in Lexington. Using an early box camera, she exposed 6 plates. When developed, each showed the same anomaly: twin silhouettes faintly visible behind the trees, the second slightly delayed in stance, as if mirroring the first a breath too late. Convinced it was a shutter error, she took new exposures at shorter intervals. The result repeated, always 2 figures, never 1. She left the negatives with a local chemist, who later recorded that the emulsion darkened overnight without light exposure, as though struck by residual current. The chemist's report reached no journal, yet a carbon copy survives. At its bottom, he added a personal remark: "The pattern identical to traces noted after the telegraph fires. Per 59, double strike on same wire. It was the final time anyone linked the hollow to that distant solar event, whose charged sky had first framed the lock's birth. By mid-January, heavy snow isolated Rowan County. The boarding house is emptied. The church held service only once. Travelers along the ridge spoke of a glow at the valley's base, a steady lantern light that moved without path. One man, Corbin Dell, rode out hoping to retrieve stray livestock. He returned at dawn pale and wordless, leading his horse by the reins. Later he told the sheriff, "They're walking in step down there, just under the snow." He left Kentucky the next week and was never heard from again. At month's end, the county registrar issued a final administrative notice, closing all pending property accounts tied to the abandoned parcel. The statement reads simply, "Boundaries dissolved by natural process." Beneath, in smaller script, a clerk added, "No measurement stays fixed." The ledger's ink, even after a century, shows twin impressions of each line, as if the pen had pressed twice. With that document, the lock hollow ceased to exist on paper. The next census omitted it entirely, listing only woodland south of Mill Road. Yet local hunters and trappers avoided the spot for decades. They said that some nights, when the air turned brittle and quiet, the snow across the valley would rise in 2 narrow ridges, shifting outward and in again, as though something beneath was breathing, steady and synchronized, waiting for spring to thaw what remained unfinished. The thaw came late that year. By March, when the ridges above Rowan County began to green, the hollow still held its crust of ice. The townspeople treated it as a boundary. Wagons turned north rather than cross, and even children stopped their play when wind drifted from that direction. The silence that had settled since winter grew heavy enough that it seemed to press on the chest when spoken of aloud. Among the few who ventured close was Elias Ward, a field hand tasked with clearing fallen branches along the new forest line. He reported that the creek ice hummed like taut wire. Thinking it an effect of thawing pressure, he struck the surface with his axe. The sound answered in 2 tones, low then higher, a perfect octave apart. Frightened, he fled, leaving the tool embedded in the ice. When a foreman returned weeks later, the axe was gone, the hole frozen smooth. That April, a small landslide exposed the remains of the lock cellar again. Inside, workers found only damp stone and a single scrap of linen stitched with 2 initials, M.L. The county sent it to the Lexington Historical Society, whose curator noted the thread color, deep crimson, still vivid despite decay. He stored it in a glass envelope with the label "Recovered Textile." 1859-1909. The archive would later report that the cloth occasionally shifted inside the sealed case, edges curling and relaxing, as though responding to unseen draft. At nearly the same time, Dr. Helen Rusk, now recovering in Chicago, wrote her final letter on the subject. In it, she confessed that she had destroyed most of her field notes, but could not forget the double hum beneath her feet. If souls possess charge, she wrote, then the locks merely proved conduction. She ended with a single line that many later quoted, "Rebirth is not miracle, but current seeking return." Meanwhile, Kentucky newspapers devoted columns to the approaching solar anniversary, the 50th year since the Carrington event of 1859. Editors reminded readers of the nights when heavens burned and telegraphs sang. None mentioned the hollow, yet in the counties closest to it, telegraph lines flickered strangely that August, clicking twice for each pulse. Operators blamed damp wires. Older men muttered that the air was remembering. By autumn, vines had consumed the last visible stone of the lock house. Hunters told of soft light seeping through roots where the foundation had been. The local priest, asked whether the land should be blessed again, declined. Some prayers, he said, already have two voices. And so the case of the Lock twins reached its quietest hour, the point where official record and whispered recollection met and fell silent together. The dates matched too neatly. Birth beneath a storm that electrified the world, disappearance beneath its echo 50 years later. Only the ground kept count, one breath drawn, one released, forever waiting for the next to begin. By late autumn, the valley's map was already redrawn. The new survey line placed the former Lock Hollow under the category Forest Reserve, no habitation. Yet those who worked the surrounding timber swore they still felt a tremor whenever the wind blew east. One logger, Henry Fosdick, wrote home describing the strangest quiver in the soles of my boots, as if a saw ran beneath the ground. He and his crew abandoned the area after two of their mules bolted and plunged into the creek without sound or splash, vanishing under the ice before they could be cut free. The following week, a government clerk from Frankfurt arrived to finalize compensation claims from the burned courthouse. Her name was Miss Clara Dorset, daughter of the telegraph operator, who had once measured the hum at the site. She carried a list of damaged documents, including the lost lock ledgers, and sought any surviving duplicates. At the Moorhead archive, she discovered a folder mislabeled LOC. Inside were fragments of birth certificates, each stamped with duplicate numbering, one sequence ending in 59, the other in 09. On the margin of the first page, someone had penciled the word repeat. Clara, by all accounts a meticulous bureaucrat, took the file back to her boarding room and began to copy its legible sections. Her notes survive in her estate papers. Names appear twice, signatures identical though pressure differs. Ink slightly magnetic. The next morning, when she tried to resume, the sheets had fused together into one thickened page, lettering superimposed as if printed upon itself. That evening she suffered a fainting spell, claiming to hear two children reciting numbers in perfect alternation. She left town the next day, abandoning both her claim work and the file. It was never recovered. Before the year closed, a letter reached the Lexington Herald, addressed simply to anyone who still counts. The handwriting matched Vaughan's earlier correspondence, though the ink appeared newer. The message contained no greeting, only a single paragraph. The current completes its circle. 50 years between sparks. 50 years between breaths. Do not mistake silence for rest. No envelope was signed, but postal marks confirmed its origin in Rowan County. The Herald declined publication, noting it as anonymous crank material. The page later darkened, leaving two silhouettes of the text, one faintly offset, as if copied by invisible hand. Snow returned in December, thick enough to level the last fence posts. Travelers on the upper ridge saw no trace of the hollow except an unbroken sheet of white. Yet a few swore that when the moon rose, twin shadows crossed its surface, drifting slowly apart before merging again. Their footprints, if any existed, were buried by morning, and so ended the final winter recorded within that boundary. The last season before the name lock passed entirely into rumor, half history, half echo, waiting only for another charge of light to stir it awake. When the thaw of 1910 arrived, the last traces of the Lock homestead dissolved into the river mud. The county men sent to mark the forest boundary found only a hollowed impression where the mill once stood, half filled with water, the color of tarnished silver. Their report was brief. No structures, no markers, terrain stable. Yet one of them, Robert Kane, added privately in a note to his wife, "We heard singing under the water. 2 voices, small and even." He never returned to the site. Weeks later, the state cartographer finalized his map. He scratched out the name Loch Hollow with a single line of blue pencil and wrote Unnamed Valley. When the copper plate was printed, however, 2 faint impressions of the erased letters appeared side by side, a double ghost of the same word. The printer blamed a slip in the press, but the platemaster swore he had seen only 1 mark upon it. In June, a boy fishing the creek near the old boundary pulled from the current a small wooden spool bound in red thread. Inside was a strip of paper bearing a child's careful script, "Still here." The message was taken to the county office and quietly burned. No record of the boy's name remains. That summer brought heat and thunder. Telegraph operators across the region reported interference, short bursts that repeated twice at irregular intervals, always from the same direction. The Department of Telegraphy logged it as ground return anomaly, probable mineral origin. For those who remembered the stories of 1859, the pattern felt like an anniversary. The air itself seemed to pulse, and on certain nights the clouds flashed without lightning, illuminating the hills in pairs of quick white glows. Old residents along the ridge said the ground had begun to breathe again. 1 long sigh every hour, they told travelers, and then the silence answers. The county ignored them. Timber lines crept back over the clearing. Vines masked what remained of the mill wheel. By autumn, not even the creek could be seen from the road. Only the scent of iron lingered when storms passed. A final mention of the hollow appears in the parish ledger of 1909 to 1910, penned by Reverend Thompson. "Mass said for those unnamed who dwell beneath." After that, no church nor courthouse spoke the Loch surname again. The papers, the maps, the testimonies all ended there, as though the earth had drawn a second breath and chosen not to release it. Yet travelers, even decades later, swore that if one stood in the valley at dusk and spoke a single name twice, the echo would not return, it would answer. 2 syllables the same, carried softly through the trees before fading into the hum of distant wires. The place holds its own pulse still, 1 life taken, 1 borrowed, both forever caught in the circuit of 1859, and when the wind rises from the east, the ground whispers its reply. Not gone, only repeating. Always twice.